Shalom everyone, and welcome back to another Torah video here in the Pilgrim Youth channel. My name is Elizabeth Inicio, and I hope that you all have had a great week of learning and spiritual growth. Today I am very happy to announce that we will begin studying Sefer Devarim, which is the book of Deuteronomy, where we will continue to analyze the lives and the events or history that the people of Israel experienced as a nation. We're going to be reviewing their ups and downs and how they eventually received the promised land. A little bit about the book of Devarim. We should know that Moshe is the author who wrote it, and he wrote it when he was 120 years old. This book is written as a reminder of the Torah to the generation of Israel who were about to enter the promised land. Perhaps those who were delivered in a single day, since we know that 40 years, 11 months, and 1 day had already passed. And the first generation of Israelites from 20 years old and up had been left prostrated in the desert. Except, of course, as we have already studied, that Yehoshua or Joshua and Caleb, due to the event that occurred with the 10 spies, were the only two adults that survived until they were able to inherit the promised land. The purpose of this book was to exhort and motivate the young generation of their history so that they would not repeat the same mistakes and suffer the same consequences as the previous generation did. And this was in order for them to choose to obey the Creator and fulfill their purpose as a holy nation. In Scripture, it is noticeable how the Eternal, Yeshua, the prophets, and the emissaries consistently use the method of repetition, repeating the instruction so we do not forget and act according to our flesh. It is with great importance for us in our youth to pay attention to the instruction given to us in repetition and to remember the words of the Eternal over and over again. When we go to bed, when we wake up, when we're in the house, when we're up and about, and at every moment to stay on the path and be able to overcome our flesh. Because in the face of adversity, our human nature tends to spring forth, which is why it is important to consistently keep in mind the instruction of the Eternal, to be able to react according to His will in any situation we may find ourselves. With this short introduction, let us begin with our study that is titled, Remember These Words to Overcome Your Flesh and Not Perish. And we're going to be centering in chapter 1 all the way through 3. And we are going to read from chapter 1, verse 1, all the way up to 5. It says the following. These are the words that Moshe spoke to all Israel across the Jordan, in the wilderness, in the Arba opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Dizahab. It is 11 days' journey from Herob by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. Now Moshe spoke to Ben Yisrael, according to all Adonai had commanded him for them. In the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, after he had struck down Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth and Edrei. Across the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moshe began to explain this Torah, saying. So we see that Deuteronomy begins with detailing the exact location and time Israel was about to enter the promised land. It says that Moshe was across the Jordan River in the Arba, and said that the journey that Israel took 40 years to eventually take over the land should have really been only an 11-day journey. As we will read further down the study, the delay was caused by their consistent disobedience and murmuring, which stemmed from a lack of faith. It was because they demonstrated in their attitude, in their life, in their testimony, a profound distrust in the Eternal's plan for them. In verse 5, scriptures confirm that Moshe began explaining and exhorting Israel by reminding them of the events in the upcoming verses that we will see. Additionally, the words given to him by the Almighty, the additional words, that was given to Moshe was not a product of Moshe's own emotion or Moshe's own thoughts or his own guidance, but rather they were words that he was about to tell Israel, given to him by the Almighty with the purpose of transmitting the will of the Eternal to the Israelites. In verse 8, it tells us that Moshe wanted Israel to finally be able to inherit the promised land that was vowed by the Eternal to their fathers, as it says to Abraham, to Isaac, and Yaakov. And not only to them, but the Eternal wanted their descendancy, their generations, to be able to inherit the land that the Eternal promised to the patriarchs. This commandment was actually given to Israel shortly after their liberation from Egypt, but as we know, they did not do so because they lacked faith in the Eternal and doubted in Elohim. From verse 9 to 18, Moshe reminds Israel about the need he had to appoint judges. The burden that was placed on Moshe to carry out was very heavy because, as we already know, that the people of Israel had multiplied in Egypt like the stars of heaven. These judges, however, had to be upright men, capable of issuing fair and impartial judgments, and had to be men who were against greed, and they were men who feared the Eternal, that respected and honored the Eternal. From this, we learn how we should be in our character as well, and how our way of conduct should be before the Eternal, and how, as disciples of Yeshua, we are to judge all things, starting from our own life, diligently, trying to present ourselves as approved workers before our Elohim, living in holiness, obedience, and above all things, being doers of the word, leading with an example of integrity, practicing what we learn and study in the Torah, and imitating the example of Mashiach. From verse 19 to 46 in the same chapter until the end of the chapter, we see that Moshe recounts the problem that surged among the people of Israel when Adonai commanded them to take possession of the land, but they were too afraid to obey, and because of this, they sent 10 spies to inspect the land beforehand. They became desperate, and after the 10 spies returned, they became once again sad and discouraged from the negative report that the 10 of those spies that were spies gave. As we already studied in the book of Numbers, their true enemies were not the Anakim that were living in Canaan, but those who were within their community, those who were spreading fear, who were spreading doubt, who was spreading disbelief, and allowed their emotions to paralyze them, believing to be incapable of overtaking the land of Elohim that Elohim promised to them. As humans, we have these emotional reactions. I can think about how we can put ourselves in their shoes, and probably we would have reacted the same way, especially because when we go through a difficult situation and we do not see a way out, sadness and discouragement immediately starts to overcome our spirit. But as believers, we have to learn that our trust and security in the Eternal should not depend on the circumstances that happen around us. If we are faithful to the Father in our life by being obedient to His instruction, we should not demonstrate actions or fruits of doubt, fruits of fearfulness. So we should have a total conviction. Instead, we should have a total conviction that the Eternal is in control of our life. His plans are always better, and every test is an opportunity for the Eternal to be exalted in our life. In this recount, Moshe tells us of additional details of the narrative of the 10 spies that we did not see in the book of Numbers. It says that Israel murmured against the Eternal, saying, in verse 27, in your tents you grumbled and said, because Adonai hates us, he has brought us out from the land of Egypt to hand us over to the Amorites to destroy us. We see here that Israel really thought that Elohim was going to deliver them into the hands of their enemies, the Amorites, and with the purpose of destroying them. It would seem impossible to believe that after all of the things that the Eternal had done for them, that he brought them out of Egypt with a powerful hand, he opened the sea for them, he had just given them triumph over their enemies, and they had seen with their own two eyes that Elohim was with them when he appeared in Sinai. It's sometimes even unthinkable of how could, and we ask ourselves maybe, right, how could they think that about the Eternal, right, after seeing so many miracles that the Almighty had done, and now because they were in a very, in their eyes, they were in a situation of life and death, that they were starting to say that the Eternal was unfair, that actually the Eternal wanted to destroy them. And here we completely see what was truly inside of the hearts of these Israelites, men and women, that they showed a complete distrust and rebellion against the Eternal. So reflecting a little bit on this aspect, it tells us a lot about humanity. And what we can understand is that when everything is going well and we see the powerful hand of the Eternal, then we are persuaded to believe, and then we believe that he is with us, right? But in the face of adversity, we begin to deny and our flesh begins to spring forth, thus making us believe that the Creator has abandoned us, because our human eyes do not see how we will pass these tests. But Scripture teaches us the very opposite. And Yeshua, our Mashiach himself, said that we are going to have a lot of afflictions in this world and that we are going to be tested. And of course, as humans, we do not like these situations. We don't want to go through these painful experiences. But the fact is that we definitely do need to go through them in order for us to be refined as gold. As Hebrews 12:11 tells us the following, now all discipline seems painful at the moment, not joyful, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. So if we want to be righteous boys and girls, men and women in the path of the Eternal, then discipline is something that we have to get used to. It's something that we must receive with humbleness, and we have to receive with gratitude from the Eternal, just as we receive everything else. And being able to receive this discipline, that although at the time it may seem like the cause of our pain, and we at times might even want to avoid it, but we need to remember that Scripture says that it bears the peaceful fruits of righteousness to those who have been exercised by it. And this is what makes us change the way that we see the tests. We can understand that they are these challenges, these tests, this pain is not to weaken us, but with the purpose of transforming us until we reach the stature of Mashiach, as we reach the maturity of Mashiach. And that the Father expects our perseverance. He accepts it. He wants to see how we persevere in this life, that if we're truly saying that we love the Eternal and that we believe in the Eternal, then we should be able to show it in our life, that we respond with faith, knowing that he will fulfill his promise. Just that what we have to do is that we have to remain faithful in integrity, sanctification, and keep his instruction and the faith of Yeshua in our life. In verse 28, it says the following, where are we going? Our brothers have discouraged our hearts, saying, the people are greater and taller than we are. The sites are great and fortified up to the heavens. Besides, we have even seen the children of Anakim there. It is evident that the Israelites had lost complete faith in Adonai. But As believers, it is important for us to remember what 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 7 says, that we walk by faith and not by sight. In this instance, the Israelites were behaving like people of the nations who did not know anything of Elohim. They couldn't see beyond their limitations. The walls that in their mind were very high, and that they were not able to overcome the giants that their eyes were seeing. From their perspective, they were already defeated. And here we can also understand, in terms of our service to the Eternal, how sometimes we ourselves can limit and put limitations to our service. Sometimes we may feel incapable of serving the Eternal and truly consecrating our lives, because we're saying, well, we have, for example, when we come to learn about the commandments that the Eternal has for us as youth, as keeping purity, right? And we see that the world does the total opposite, where the Eternal commands us to keep his holy days, his days of convocation, which is completely different from the days of rest of the world. And now we're faced to make decisions in our life if we're going to listen to what the Eternal is asking us and requiring us to change about our life, or are we going to assimilate? Are we going to simply just know what the Eternal wants but not actually do it? And at first, we may think that making all of these changes may be difficult or simply impossible to do. Same goes with other things, such as like stopping bad habits, not having a full commitment to the Eternal, or changing the way that we act. And if we begin to think this way, we begin to limit ourselves the way that Israel was limiting themselves when they saw these giants. And it is certain that we are not going to overcome our struggles if we continue in this mindset, allowing ourselves to be dominated by fear, paralyzing us and making us fall into a spiritual conformity, and a spiritual lukewarmness, where we are afraid to leave our comfort zone and feel like we are not capable of offering the Father a service just as he is asking, a service that is clean, a service that is complete. As believers, we must not focus on our limitations as humans, but on what the Eternal can do if we decide to trust and act according to his will. And then we can apply what Shaul wrote in Philippians 4 verse 13, that he says, I can do all things through Mashiach who strengthens me. If we have the disposition to serve the Eternal, if we begin to strive to put his word into practice, we ask him and we cry out to him to give us wisdom, discernment, and self-control, we begin to see how his power is perfected in our weakness, and how those giants that we think are giants and we are not able to overcome, or the walls are so high that we are never able to be able to break down, are nothing compared to what the Creator can do in our life that is restored, in a life that is vivified in Mashiach. It's just that the one thing that we have to do is to decide to walk by faith and not by sight. In the same chapters and verses, Moshe reminded Israel of everything that the Eternal had done for them. He wanted to make them reflect and to recognize Elohim's power in their life until that point. And he told them, do not be blinded, nor be afraid of what you see or what you hear. The Eternal had delivered you from your enemies, and not only that, Moshe tells them that Elohim himself would fight for them. There was no greater security than that. Can you imagine that the Eternal was literally telling the people of Israel that he was going to fight for them, that they had nothing to fear? They were not alone. And we see this in scripture over and over again, but sometimes when we're going through very difficult times, we tend to forget these promises. We tend to forget all the good that the Eternal has done in our life. This is something that as believers we must always keep in mind, that we are not alone. In moments of difficulty or when we may have certain fears, we must not doubt that the Father is the one who is sustaining our life. Only in him should our trust be. Whether we live or whether we die, we belong to the eternal. Who else can we go to, right? Our complete hope is in the eternal. And if we remain faithful to him, in his time, he will make us inherit the promise of eternity in his presence. Sadly, we see that the Israelites, even though they were knowing of all of the good that the eternal had done for them, and how the eternal as a father carried them as a son, and how the Almighty was taking care of them, they still did not believe. Disbelief and rebellion dominated the people of Israel. For this reason, I consider that the main teaching of this event, of what we have seen already that occurred with the children of Israel, is faith. Because although we may be able to know the Torah from back to front, as many people in Israel probably knew, we know that without faith, without trust, without certainty, fidelity, and security in the Creator, in his promise, we and our life cannot be pleasing before the Almighty. Because without faith, it is impossible to be an aroma, a fragrance that is acceptable to him in our sacrifice of our life. So this is something that we have to definitely reflect on. And just as this new generation had to come to the point of reflection and recognition in their life, and how, seeing the example that they didn't have, they were supposed to be able to now move forward in a different way and decide differently. The same thing the eternal is giving for us today. We may have an example in our parents' life, or maybe if our parents have already given us a good example, we see the people that are outside in the world who do not have the word of the eternal, who simply live a life just for existing, and they have no purpose in life. So we have all of these examples, and the example of Israel to help us as youth be able to understand that without the eternal, we are nothing, and that we have to be thankful to the eternal for all the good that he's done in our life, for the purpose of doing teshuvah, of coming back to him in obedience. We know that the generation lost the opportunity to enter the land. The generation that came before, they were going to take the promised land. They had already tempted the Almighty 10 times. They angered him greatly due to their rebellions, their doubts, and their murmuring against him. And as we studied in the book of Numbers, this event is repeated here. Only Caleb and Joshua stood firm and decided not to be defeated by those internal giants, but rather their faith in the eternal was greater, and the Father allowed them to inherit the earth, inherit the promised land in this context, which shows that the eternal is pleased with those who trust in him. The best attitude that we can have before the eternal is of faith and obedience in all stages of our life. Elohim is our refuge and our strength, just as Psalms chapter 46, verse 1-3 tells us. And within the same verses, when the new generation of Israel heard Moshe's words, they heard Moshe's recap, or we could say that going back to the generation that Moshe was referring to, when they heard that they were being rebellious before the eternal because they didn't want to take the inheritance, they didn't want to go into the land because they were scared of the giants of the walls, and Moshe rebuked them and told them that what they were doing, what they were saying, what they were thinking was completely incorrect, then we see that they started to grieve. And not only to grieve, but then they started to act irrational. They started to decide to go and conquer the land by their own force. We can see here and we can learn that it is better to obey from the beginning. When the eternal tells us that something is incorrect, may we ask the eternal to help us to truly leave the things that are not good for us and to start doing and obeying the eternal the first time that he tells us. And as many times as humans, this is the attitude that we have. when we feel in danger or threatened, that's when we actually start doing what we need to do. And it should not be this way, right? We should be able to listen, and when even in times of peace, even in times where we are not going through a test, we're not going through a challenge, we should be strengthening ourselves in the word of the Eternal so we can continue to obey his word even when we're not going through difficulty. And what happened to this generation that Moshe was recounting about, was remembering about, was reminding them, is a great example for us. It teaches us not to waste time. If we know the Father's instructions today and the promises we have in Mashiach, let us not leave the service for tomorrow. Let us, with the Eternal's, let us persevere, because this is the time to do it. In short, this entire chapter teaches us to comply with what the Eternal commands, when and how he orders it, and not to try to do it in our own way. Therefore, let us be obedient and allow ourselves to be guided by the Ruach HaKodesh of the Eternal, with humility, since we cannot conquer the promised land by our own strength, only with the help of the Creator and through his Son. As Hebrews 4:1-2 tells us the following: Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them, because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. So in order for us to have the same value, in order for us to receive the same promise, we must have the faith that the Father is expecting from all of the believers in his word and in his Son. And now we're going to move on to Deuteronomy chapter 2. From verse 1-3 says the following: Then we turned and journeyed into the wilderness by the way to the Sea of Reeds, just as Adonai told me. We went around the hill country of Seir for many days. Adonai spoke to me, saying, You have gone around this hill country long enough. Turn to the north. In chapter 2, Moshe continues to recount the journeys to which they circled the road of Seir. But when the 40th year passed, the Eternal commanded them to continue the road towards the promised land. They had to pass by the land of Seir. The children of Esau did not let them pass, but the Eternal told them not to bother them. Something similar happened with the Moabites. The Almighty granted them their lands because they fought for them and defeated all the race of the giants that were living in their time, who lived in those territories. And it was interesting to see in a comment given by the Strong's commentary on these nations that say the following: Their territory included a good region south of the Arnon and partly north of the same river. They had conquered it by force of arms of the original inhabitants, the Enim, which was a terrible race, as their name signified, for their physical power and stature, as we can find it in Genesis chapter 14, verse 5. In the same way, the Edomites had achieved their dominion by the defeat of the original occupants of Seir, the Horim, as we see it in Genesis chapter 14, verse 6, who were troglodytes, or cave dwellers. Moshe referred to these circumstances to be able to encourage this new generation of Israel to believe in Elohim, that Elohim would allow them to drive out all of these wicked and cursed Canaanites, just as they did to previous nations who were considered by humanity as strong and maybe almost undefeatable. But to the Eternal, there were people that did not follow his instructions. The Moabites, having lost most of their possessions through the usurpation of Sihon, were reduced to a small but fertile region between the Zered and the Arnon. The Israelites remembered the triumph that the Eternal offered them over Sinon, king of Heshbon, and the Amorites. When they installed fear in all these nations because the Eternal acted on their behalf, and in this way they conquered and dominated all of these territories until they took possession of the land, there was no doubt that the Eternal, that the Creator, was going to be with them and give them the triumph over his enemies. Talking about the people that were inhabiting, that were living in the land of Canaan at the time. In verse 19 to 37, in verse 19, it says specifically, "When you come opposite to the sons of Ammon, do not harass or provoke them, for I will not give you any of the land of the sons of Ammon for a possession, because I have given it to the sons of Lot for a possession." The Ammonites, being relatives of the Moabites, out of respect for the memory of their common ancestors, they were not to be provoked or bothered by the Israelites. The territory of this people had been directly north of Moab and extended to the Jabbok, having been taken by them from a number of Canaanite tribes. That is the Zamumim, which was a presumptuous tribes of giants. As their name indicates, the Avim were natives of the district that extended from Zazerim or Hazeroth, even to Azah, which is today Gaza, but of which they had been disposed by the Philistines, who came out of Lower Egypt, and they settled on the west coast of Palestine. So all of this is to say that how to see the limits of the Amorites that were now reduced, but they still possessed the hill country beyond the Jabbok. So Moshe was recounting all of these conquests that the Eternal gave to the people of Israel, but Moshe also was reminding Israel of their limits, that they could not take any land that Israel felt like taking or driving out people. They had to respect the Eternal's instruction about taking land where other people were living. Here we see how the Eternal is just and does not treat any nation as superior or above the Creator's order. As we see here in Psalms 89 verse 14, that says the following: "Righteousness and justice are the foundations of your throne. Love and faithfulness go before you." So these are attributes that the Eternal has in his nature, and how, according to all of these attributes that he has, he instructed humanity on what was the limitations, what were they allowed to take, and what they had to leave alone. So here we can see in chapter 2 more of these details of how Israel on their journey were able to conquer, and what lands to take and what lands to back off. And in chapter 3, from verse 1 to 11, we continue to see that Moshe gives an account of the people's conquest, this time with Og, king of Bashan. All these nations were selected to be exterminated, as we remember. We have studied previously that the Eternal's judgments was kindled against these nations because of their great genetic perversion. That's why we see the deformities of these human beings as being giants that had deformities that were very different. So these nations were very corrupt in their core. They would put their children through fire. They committed all kinds of immoralities and focused their service to worshiping pagan deities. For this reason, the instruction of the Eternal was so severe against these nations, and they were completely destroyed. From verse 12 to 20 in chapter 3, Moshe highlights the request that we saw two studies ago about the request that the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh expressing the desire to want to inherit the land on the other side of the Jordan, since they considered it good land for their livestock, which they had a lot of. However, these tribes had the obligation to go with their brothers into battles until the other tribes took possession of the promised land. As an agreement to inheriting the lands that they wanted to, they agreed and they fulfilled their vow to be with their brethren to help them fight and conquer that land, so their brethren can also have a place to live. And they were the ones who went in the front row of the fight until the rest had inherited their share of the land. From verse 21 to 29 of chapter 3, it centers Moshe's words of affirmation and encouragement towards Joshua, the man chosen by the Eternal to lead the Israelites into the promised land. In verse 21 to 22, that says the following: I commanded Joshua at the time, saying, your eyes have seen all that Adonai your Elohim has done to these two kings. Adonai will do the same to all the kingdoms you are about to cross into. You must not fear them, for it is Adonai your Elohim who fights for you. Moshe encourages Joshua in these words, in these verses, and it's affirming him that what the Eternal did with these nations that we just talked about that were exterminated, he would also do to the Canaanites, and exhorts him to remain firm, to remain faithful in the promise. And all of this teaches us something very important as believers, that we must persevere in the Creator and not doubt that he will fulfill his promise in our life. Moshe remembers as well in these verses that the Eternal did not allow him to enter the promised land, only to contemplate it from above or from far. But as we have already studied, the plans of the Creator with Moshe was not something merely earthly, but something celestial, inheritance that is imperishable, that which all disciples of Mashiach await once he returns. So, in conclusion, Sefer Devarim reminds us of the importance of repetition in our life. That as young people, we are to reflect in the scriptures day and night, to never grow tired or weary of the Eternal's rebuke, discipline, and challenges or tests while we are still living in our pilgrimage here on earth. May the Eternal help us all to be humble and meek, to receive everything that the Eternal sends in our way with gratitude and in complete trust that he loves us and wants for us to inherit the celestial dwellings that Mashiach went to prepare. Thank you all for your attention, and I hope that you all have a blessed week and a restful Shabbat. Have a great day, and if the Eternal permits, I shall see you in another video. Shalom.